Okay, we will get started here. So good afternoon, well, good morning, not afternoon yet. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Gary Winthrop. I'm the market sector lead for oil and gas at Matrix Solutions, which is the Canadian consulting division of the Montrose Environmental Group. I'll be moderating today's technical webinar. I would like to begin with the traditional land acknowledgement for the Calgary area where I am located today.
Oops.
Calgary is situated on the land where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Blackfoot name for this place is Mohkinstsis. We are in Treaty 7 territory of southern Alberta, which includes the traditional territories of the Blackfoot nations, including the Siksika and Kainai, as well as Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda nations, Piikani, and the Calgary Elbow Métis District 6. The title of our webinar is Time to Retire, Key Considerations for Successful Pipeline Abandonment, presented by Jeff Rao, Jennifer Dowd, and Diane Schultz of Matrix Solutions. The presentation is approximately 40 minutes in length and will be recorded. We'll take some time at the end to address any questions you might have. If you do have a question, you can type it in at any point during the presentation using the Q&A function, not the chat function, Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which should pop up as you scroll over that area. Depending on how many questions we get, we'll endeavor to address them all at the end of the presentation, or we'll follow up directly afterwards with you. We will also share the presentation recording via email afterwards. And now an introduction of our presenters. Jeff Rao is a senior regulatory advisor and sector lead for the midstream and pipelines market at Matrix. He's a senior environmental planner with 22 years of environmental experience in government, nonprofit, and industry settings. Mr. Rao has managed both provincially and federally regulated pipeline projects in Western Canada. He has progressed from a technical specialist in the fields of wildlife biology, environmental planning, and permitting to managing major pipeline projects and advising project teams. Mr. Rao has particular experience with environmental effects assessments, routing large pipeline projects, as well as developing and managing mitigation strategies to support construction. Jeff has a Bachelor's of Science degree from Lakehead University. Jennifer Dowd is a principal environmental scientist at Matrix. She has 18 years of consulting experience, including environmental site assessments, remediation, screening level risk assessments within oil and gas and forest industries. Jennifer's core expertise includes leading, managing, and providing technical oversight for large portfolios of projects to achieve closure objectives. She has worked in Northeast BC for most of her career and is familiar with regulations under both the BCER and the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. She has a Master of Science degree in Natural Resources and Environmental Studies, Environmental Science from the University of Northern British Columbia, and is a licensed professional agrologist in BC. Diane Schultz is a senior environmental advisor with over 24 years of professional consulting experience across Canada with federal and provincial applications. She has extensive experience preparing environmental and socioeconomic assessments for the Canada Energy Regulator, formerly the NEB, including expert witness testimony. She has also led projects that were regulated by the BC Environmental Assessment Office and presented environmental field studies and mitigation measures to stakeholders, First Nations, communities, and regulatory agencies. So Jeff, I will turn it over to you now, and I'll join you again at the end to facilitate questions.
Thanks, Gary. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our session today. Discussions surrounding the effects of pipeline abandonment in Canada heated up in the 1990s, and it's these discussions and research that has led to the current pipeline abandonment requirements we see today in the Canadian Energy Regulator Filing Manual under Guide B for pipeline abandonment. We anticipate that we will continue to see changes in the provincial regulatory requirements in the future to address the environmental, land, and financial matters associated with pipeline abandonment. A good example of some recent developments in Alberta is the Alberta Energy Regulator's release of the new Liability Management Framework, which is still open to public comment until November 8th, 2024. We are currently working with a few of our clients and the AR to better understand the potential impacts of these changes. The agenda today includes an overview of the recent BC regulatory changes, historical overview of pipeline abandonment research in Canada, outcomes and considerations of that research, current pipeline abandonment methodologies, and data management considerations. So to kick us off, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Jennifer Dowd, who will provide an overview of the recent regulatory requirements in BC. Take it away, Jen.
Thanks, Jeff. So on January 30th, 2023, the BC Energy Regulator provided an information update that they were indicating that they were making updates to the dormancy and shutdown regulations. And those updates were to establish firm timelines for the decommissioning, assessment, and restoration of pipelines that would become effective January 1st, 2024. So under that regulation, the definition of a dormant pipeline in BC was identified to be any pipeline or part of a pipeline that has not transported fluids over the last 5 calendar years, and whether the BCR had received written notice that the pipeline is dormant from the permit holder. So I took a look at the list of dormant pipelines just maybe a week or two ago now, and there was 7,515 dormant pipelines in BC on that list. Next slide, please, Jeff. So of those 7,515 dormant pipelines, the timelines identified for the decommissioning of a pipeline is 5 years from the dormancy date. Once it's been decommissioned, they have 2 years to complete assessment of those pipelines and 3 years once the assessment's complete to fully restore the pipelines. So basically, the permit holder has 10 years once a pipeline is deemed dormant to have it fully restored. So those 7,515 pipelines were all fully restored when they were first constructed, but additional work will be required once the assessment, decommissioning, and abandonment of those lines has happened. And additionally, because of when all of those pipelines were deemed dormant at the beginning of January 1st, 2024, they will all need to be restored by a deadline of December 31st, 2034. Now, the dormancy regulations don't give specific guidance on the mechanisms for decommissioning, but it does reference the obligations on cancellations and cesations of operations in the pipeline regulation and expect that all surface facilities and associated equipment are removed. There's a brief update on how they're dealing with some of the assessment and restoration of those lines, and the exact mechanism for those assessments and restorations is still not really clear. But as for now, that's kind of an update of where they are at with dormant pipelines in BC. And I'll pass it back to Jeff to talk about different abandonment methods.
Excellent. Thanks, Jen. If anyone has any questions to these changes or regarding these changes, we'll be providing some time at the end of our presentation. Now we're going to take a look into some of the research that went into the Canadian energy regulatory requirements we see today. Just a couple of reminders as we go along. Regardless of what provincial jurisdiction applies to your project, all pipeline abandonment projects are required to adhere to the Canadian Standards Association Z662 oil and gas pipeline system requirements and procedures. And when discussing pipeline abandonment, we are primarily referring to federally regulated oil and gas pipelines in Canada. I should also point out that the information provided today focused primarily on the effects of abandoning a pipeline in place. It is understood in the industry that the environmental effects associated with removing a pipeline are similar to those associated with pipeline construction and are generally well known. There's a substantial amount of research on this topic, so here we'll be highlighting some of the key ones. As I mentioned, discussions around pipeline abandonment heated up in the 1990s with the development of the Pipeline Abandonment Steering Committee, which included representatives from CAP, which is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, CEPA, the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, the Alberta Energy and Utilities Board, and the National Energy Board. At the same time, there was also a pipeline abandonment legal working group, which is looking at the financial matters associated with pipeline abandonment, including the liability and funding needs to be addressed. Then in 1996, a discussion paper on the technical and environmental issues associated with pipeline abandonment was released to assist companies in the development of an abandonment plan by recognizing the general issues resulting from a pipeline abandonment and to also provide the means to address those issues. The report identified the key features of an abandonment plan. The report concluded that the abandonment plan should be tailored to the specific project, provide early and open opportunity for public and landowner input, comply with current regulatory requirements, and encompass post-abandonment responsibilities such as monitoring and remediation. After this discussion paper was released, it became evident that the more research was required to understand the potential impacts of abandoning a pipeline in place. And in 2006, SEPA published a follow-up report. The goal of this report was to provide the baseline assumptions to be considered in an abandonment plan. It was generally accepted after this 2006 report that further research was required to explore the potential effects of abandoning a pipeline in place. Shortly after the 2006 SEPA report, the National Energy Board contracted Detnorsky Veritas, also known as DNV, to complete a pipeline abandonment study to look into the issues identified in these documents more thoroughly. Based on the research conducted between 1996 and 2010, the following outcomes were identified. Firstly, they concluded that the effects of a pipeline removal were well known and does not require further research. They also identified that there were three methods of abandoning a pipeline, which include pipeline removal, abandonment in place, or abandonment in place with special treatment. They concluded that the method to be utilized for any given project should consider current and future land use, stakeholder consultation, subsidence, creation of water conduits, pipe exposure, and pipe cleanliness. The last outcome was the development of what is known as the SEPA matrix, which provides a decision matrix for determining which abandonment method is most appropriate for your project. We're going to take a look at each of these further. Current and future land use. This refers to each land parcel crossed by the pipeline. Landowners may have current or future plans for the property that may require the pipeline to be removed rather than being abandoned in place. Stakeholder consultation. Are there any current or historic concerns raised by stakeholders that need to be considered in the development of the abandonment plan? This could include reclamation issues such as lack of vegetation, subsidence, erosion, or contamination. Subsidence. So this begins to explore the potential for a pipeline to collapse over time, which could potentially lead to subsidence issues. It is generally considered that the risk of this occurring increases as the pipeline outside diameter increases. Water conduits. Similar to subsidence, this considers the potential for a pipeline to collapse under a watercourse or wetland that could lead to the draining of the surface water and potentially using the pipeline as a conduit, resulting in the unwanted transportation of water along the length of the pipeline. Pipe exposure. This would include situations such as low depth of cover or frost heave, which could result in pipe exposure. Cleanliness. This discusses how clean is clean. The potential for contamination varies based on the type of product in the pipeline and the pipeline coating used. For example, from the 1920s to the 1980s, pipelines could have asbestos coatings, which would require specific considerations. Now we're going to take a look at the SEPA matrix. As I mentioned previously, in the 2006 SEPA report, they presented what is known as the SEPA matrix. I've provided the original here. The matrix breaks down pipeline diameters into small, which is considered a 2-inch outside diameter to 12-inch outside diameter, medium, 14 to 24 outside diameter, large, greater than 26-inch outside diameter. It also breaks down the types of land use crossed by the pipeline, including agricultural, non-agricultural, and other areas. Agricultural areas included cultivated with special features such as depth of cover considerations, non-cultivated such as native prairie, rangeland, and pasture, Non-agriculture included existing developed lands such as commercial, industrial, or residential, and prospective future development, including commercial, industrial, residential, and also no future development anticipated, such as forested areas. Other areas included environmentally sensitive areas such as wetlands, road and rail crossings, water crossings, and other utility crossings. They also identified for each type of land use what the most appropriate abandonment methodology would be for that consideration. In the table, A equals abandon in place, R equals removal, and A plus means abandonment in place with special treatment. Special treatment typically consists of cutting and capping at certain locations or potentially filling the pipeline segments with concrete to avoid heaving. Up to 2013, the potential for abandonment pipeline to collapse and cause subsidence or the conduit effect had been hypothetical. For example, although the creation of a water conduit or subsidence from a pipeline collapse is theoretically possible, there had been little to no examples of this occurring based on the research from 1996 to 2010. So in March 2013, a Pipeline Abandonment Research Steering Committee, or PARSC, was issued a request to proposal to understand the mechanisms of corrosion and their effects on abandonment pipelines. DNV completed the research in March 2015, which concluded the following. The time to collapse will vary on pipeline diameter, wall thickness, soil type and soil properties, and pipeline depth of covers. Findings suggest that a medium diameter pipeline situated in stable soil at a typical depth of cover could support a personal truck for approximately 9,000 years before collapse. Alternatively, a large diameter pipeline buried at very shallow depth in extremely poor soil conditions may collapse by the weight of a truck within approximately 100 years. Now that we have gone through the research and the general considerations to be included in an abandonment plan, it's time to take a look at the current abandonment methodologies. There are three stages when considering abandonment: physical abandonment, reclamation monitoring, and abandoned pipeline monitoring. The first step in pipeline abandonment is physical abandonment. This is where we disconnect the pipeline to be abandoned from the existing operational system. This will include isolation of associated system connections, purging and cleaning of the pipeline, removal of all above ground facilities, potential removal of cathodic protection, removal of the pipeline where required, removal of all road and railway crossings where required, removal of utility crossings where required, and cutting, capping, and filling required. And again, where I say where required, that refers back to the SEPA matrix and those recommendations on which abandonment methodology to use for that particular segment of pipe. As part of this process, we also need to be considering what physical disturbances will be required to complete these activities. This will include pipeline segments being removed, areas to be cut and capped, pipeline segments to be filled with concrete, as well as any valve sites, cathodic protection, etc., that will physically be removed. This step also requires us to determine what additional temporary workspace will be required to complete the physical works. Based on the information, we can then scope the environmental effects assessment to identify what biological and social economic components require further study. A good example of a potential effect associated with the physical works are wildlife features such as nest, den, or niche sites that may be impacted by ground disturbance activities. Existing information to be reviewed as part of the desktop assessment include historical deficiencies identified during pipeline operation, such as historical erosion, subsidence, excessive crowning, contamination, depth of cover issues, and vegetation cover concerns. Available resources to complete this step include existing personnel, the original pipeline filing, other project reports, and any other operational and maintenance information that would inform the abandonment plan. Next, we have the stakeholder consultation. As mentioned previously, this will include future land use considerations or existing concerns, environmental effects. Once we have scoped the environmental and social economic effects, completed stakeholder consultation, as well as determining the time of the physical works required, we can then finalize the potential environmental and social economic effects associated with the project and determine the appropriate mitigation to avoid or reduce these potential effects. All this information leads to the development of the environmental protection plan required for the project and informs remaining project application deliverables. Reclamation and remediation. Phase 2 and 3 ESAs were required. So once the physical abandonment stage is complete and all the physical works required for the pipeline abandonment have been completed, it is time to complete reclamation. This will include phase 2 and 3 ESAs, that's environmental site assessments where required, reclamation to prevent topsoil or surface material loss from wind and water erosion, the establishment of vegetation cover, disturbed areas, following landowner commitments, and returning the land to equivalent land capability. Monitoring. The last stage of pipeline abandonment is the monitoring required upon completion of the pipeline abandonment. This will include monitoring after abandonment activities, confirming site conditions and land function are equivalent to adjacent land use or compatible with future development, and implementation of mitigation measures where needed. This wraps up the segmentation on pipeline abandonment methodologies. As noted, there is heavy reliance on historical information to support the development of the abandonment plan, and my colleague Diane Schultz will be going over the importance of the data management, including some considerations. Take it away, Diane.
Thanks, Jeff. Data management plays a key role in the decommissioning of a pipeline. And although I am the last presenter for today, data management should be the first question to ask when planning pipeline abandonment. When we talk about data management for pipelines, it's the collection of information throughout the life cycle of the asset. And starting the data management at decommissioning is very expensive. There are a few key points to think about when incorporating data management. So I've listed a few bullets here. And as I mentioned, decommissioning stage is really not the time to start data management. It's very costly. And if it's set up on the front end of a project, this can be prevented. Data collection spans through the planning, construction, post-construction, and monitoring of operation stages. And if an organization implements a robust data management early and maintains it through the life cycle of a project, it really reduces the liability, it reduces the costs, and helps with supporting the decision making. To standardize and make data visible to maximize your return on investment throughout the life cycle. And it's important to collaborate with those who recognize the value of long-term data management. Next slide, please. Here is the diagram that shows how data management is incorporated into the life cycle of a project. The initial inputs are during the feed design phase, and then it moves into construction, and then post-construction with operation and maintenance. As the project approaches the end of life, it's important to review the database to support decision making, and it will reduce the liability of that data collection and the decision making. Next slide. So how do we do this? Gone are the days of write on rain paper and then transcribing into reports. That method had various people touching that data, and there was human error. Today, technology has allowed data to be collected digitally, and it can reduce errors and provide a quick turnaround on field information, which then can support the decision making. Whether it's field work in the pre-planning phase or alignment sheets, which can be an invaluable resource if there isn't a digital record of the information on the pipeline, and depending on the age of the pipeline. I remember reviewing alignment sheets that were developed decades ago just to understand the soils in certain areas because we didn't have landowner access. So depending on the data collection and how the information was saved, alignment sheets may be the only way to understand the challenges at various points along a pipeline route. Recently, aerial imagery has been a new addition to data collection, such as drones. Aerial surveys are beneficial to access areas along pipeline right-of-ways that are not easily accessed for various reasons, such as crops on the field or rollback and access management for caribou ranges. Web maps have been very beneficial for supporting large pipeline projects. They can be costly to set up, but once they are set up, you get real-time data for everyone to view and comment on. Large projects such as Coastal GasLink had a web map that allowed for daily viewing of information on various phases of the project that was happening simultaneously. That wraps up data management considerations, and I will pass it back to Gary.
All right. Thanks, Jeff, Jen, and Diane. So again, folks, if you have any questions, please take a moment to get those into the Q&A. I do have a couple of questions here we can start with. So the first one, for CER regulated pipelines, are you required to file an environmental and socioeconomic assessment as part of your abandonment application?
I can take that one, Gary, if you can hear me all right.
You bet.
Yeah, you aren't required to file the ESA as part of your application, but you are required to complete one and have it for audit purposes. And that can be found under Guide B, section B.22.
Okay, sounds good. This next question might be better for you, Jen. If the facility is active, but the pipeline to it is dormant, do you still have an obligation to abandon it?
Yes. So under the new regulations, just because the dormant pipeline goes into a facility or well site that's still considered active, they would still be required to deal with that dormant pipeline segment.
Okay, sounds good. A third question here is the SEPA matrix. So I presume this is a good one for you, Jeff. Is the SEPA matrix specifically for oil and gas pipelines or also for other pipes such as water mains and sewers?
I think it could be used for all. I know from a federally regulated perspective with the Canadian Energy Regulator, it's specific to oil and gas, but I believe that the oil and gas on the onshore pipeline regulations and ZED 662, I think it also covers the importance of understanding which methodologies you're using. And so I think that would still be applicable to water lines.
Sounds good. This is a question that maybe for both you, Jeff, and Diane. If you were to speculate, what do you think will be the next regulatory change or regulatory driver that could impact the pace of pipeline decommissioning, particularly in Alberta? How soon might we see something comparable to what's going on in BC?
Jen, do you want to go first on that, or do you want me to go first? I can take it away to get it going anyways. In Alberta anyways, the one thing that strikes me is that under the liability management framework, there isn't really any discussion that I'm aware of around the actual effects of abandoning a pipeline in place, such as the conduit effect or subsidence due to a pipeline collapse. So I still think there's a gap in regards to how we're managing those liabilities in Alberta compared to that maybe with a federally regulated project. Similarly, the reclamation criteria, although more clear for the Public Lands Act or in Crown land in Alberta, it's less clear on private land. So I still think there needs to be more clarity around what the requirements are for longer pipelines that are being abandoned in place on private land in Alberta.
Sounds good. We don't have any other questions at this time. So we'll just see if people have an opportunity here over the next few seconds to get something else in the queue. I do have a little bit more of a general question for Jen. You mentioned there was, I think, over 7,000 currently abandoned pipelines in the province of BC, with an obligation to get those fully restored within the next decade. Do you have any general sentiment around, I guess, the strain that might put on the industry as a whole in order to actually accomplish that? Is that something that seems doable, or are there going to be some challenges around trying to make that work?
I mean, I think the region's capacity constrained as it is. So it just adds another layer. The general information that we're receiving from the BCER anyways is that they're hoping a lot of the assessment work can be done via desktop or with non-intrusive methods. And so I don't think that you'll see people out there drilling a hole every 10 meters along a pipeline to assess it. It'll be more targeted and going specifically looking at areas that are indicated to have problems, at least in terms of the assessment remediation portion. And then obviously there will be situations where they'll encounter things during the abandonment or decommissioning when they have to go open it up for cut and cap, or when they have to pull crossings and stuff, where you'll be able to do a better job of the assessment in those areas and determine if there's additional problems. But then there's also going to be reclamation requirements in those areas as well.
Right. Okay, thank you. So
I could probably address a question, Gary, that comes up fairly often, which is basically around if we're abandoning the pipeline in place, then why does there need to be additional assessment work done on the project? Typically, where this comes into consideration is around the physical works required for getting rid of the above ground infrastructure. So although the existing right-of-way may have been disturbed, there may be additional extra temporary workspace outside of that pre-approved right-of-way that is considered new disturbance and therefore would need to be assessed as a new disturbance. And so sometimes there's confusion around that aspect.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. There are no more questions at this time, so I think with that, we will wrap up early and everyone's just going to have to go back to work doing what you normally do. So, but thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Like we mentioned at the beginning, we will share a link to this recording via email. And also, if you still have any questions after the fact, feel free to reach out to any or all the individuals here on the contact us screen that you're looking at right now. And we hope you have a great Wednesday, remainder of your Wednesday. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.